Well, I want to thank everybody so very much for coming out this morning to be part of this really special program here at the Museum of the Big Bend in celebration of the exhibit opening of the Upshaws of County Line, an American Family. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to acknowledge and thank the following organization, groups, and individuals. I'd like to recognize and thank Sul Ross State University, the Stillwater Foundation, and the City of Alpine. Our groups, the Museum of the Big Bend Directors Advisory Council, and the Museum of the Big Bend Volunteers. And then the wonderful individuals who help make our museum the great museum that it is. My wonderful museum staff, Maggie Rumbelow and Matt Walter. I'd like to also acknowledge and thank Dr. John Handley, Stephen F. Austin State University for putting this show together and making it available for tour and exhibit. I'd also like to thank Glenn Lasoya for taking time out on a Saturday morning to come film this very important event for the Museum of the Big Bend. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the underwriters for our last night's reception and opening, Ann Calloway and Paula Wilson. I'd like to introduce our guest speakers for this morning, Dr. Savannah Williamson, Assistant Professor of History at Sul Ross State University, Richard Orton, author, photographer of the Upshaws of County Line, an American Family, and Elia Ali, great-granddaughter of Gus Upshaw, one of the three brothers who helped found County Line. So I am going to step out of the way and like to start the program with Dr. Savannah Williamson. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming. I'm excited to be here and was asked to kind of give some historical context to freedmen's communities like County Line, and there's kind of historical significance during this time period. So with that, when word of New Orleans' April 1862 surrender reached the parishes of Louisiana, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children set out towards the occupied cities in their areas. Just outside of city limits, one Union major, Frank Peck, reported in June of 1862 that a shockingly, quote, large and constantly increasing number of blacks were moving toward Union lines. Peck described the fugitive slaves of all ages and all physical conditions, a number of infants in arms, many young children, robust men and women, and a large number of lame, old, and infirm. Many had eaten nothing for days. Freedom brought former slaves the hope that suffering, sickness, and death were behind them. The Civil War, however, caused a crisis that claimed more lives than warfare and wrought havoc on the newly freed. High casualty rates resulted from dislocation, overcrowded and unsanitary conditions in Union camps, decomposing bodies, contaminated water sources, and uncertainty about how to respond to the epidemics that spread throughout the South. Ex-slaves often lacked the basic necessities for survival, including adequate shelter, clean clothing, fresh food, and access to medical care. Many former slaves struggled for survival once they secured protection behind Union lines, forming makeshift communities outside of army camps and frequently begging for scraps of uneaten or spoiled food, worn clothing and shoes, and tents. Rather than provide former bondspeople with the necessities to survive, military officials ordered free people to be relocated from camp to camp, preventing them from settling and jeopardizing the ex-slaves' health. Furthermore, smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and yellow fever epidemics, quote, resulted in a harvest of death throughout the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. As a result, the years following emancipation were devastating for African American communities during the Reconstruction era. Life after the years of slavery proved in some ways to be more difficult. Although slavery was over, the brutalities of white racial prejudice still persisted. After slavery, the government across the South instituted new laws known as black codes. These laws granted certain legal rights to blacks, including the right to marry, own property, and sue in court, but the codes also made it illegal for African Americans to serve on juries, testify against whites, or serve in state militias. Black codes also required that sharecroppers and tenant farmers sign annual labor contracts with white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested and hired out for work. Most Southern Black Americans, though free, lived in desperate rural poverty. Having been denied education and wages under slavery, ex-slaves were often forced by the necessity of their economic circumstances to rent land from former white slave owners. These sharecroppers paid rent on the land by giving a portion of their crops to the landowner. Freedmen settlements, on the other hand, were independent rural communities of African American landowners that formed in the eastern half of Texas in the years after emancipation. These freedom colonies were, to a degree, anomalies in post-war Texas, where white power elites rapidly resumed social, economic, and political control, and their agricultural systems of sharecropping came to dominate. But freedmen's strong desires for land, autonomy, and isolation from whites formed these independent black communities. Land redistribution discussions of radical Republicans in Congress, which suggested that all slaves be provided 40 acres and a mule, proved baseless, as racism towards African Americans, in addition to deeply held beliefs about racial hierarchies and white supremacy, led whites not only to deny land to free people, but to work diligently to reestablish the same systems of political, social, and economic oppression that had existed in the South before the war. Most free persons remained in the countryside and took employment with white landowners as day laborers, sharecroppers, or tenant farmers. Other large groups of former slaves moved to settlements in segregated areas adjacent to white towns. A minority of former slaves, however, set out to achieve the dream of having lands that were their own, and a remarkable number of them succeeded. Land ownership rates among African Americans in Texas rose dramatically from less than 2% in 1870 to 31% in 1900. Many of these new Texas landowners resided in freedmen settlements, informal communities of black farmers scattered across the eastern half of the state. These communities were unincorporated, individually unified by a collective understanding that their community existed for the support of each other. Many established themselves in pockets of wilderness, on sheep land, or neglected lands previously not utilized or underutilized for cotton agriculture. Still, race relations in places like Nacogdoches County have historically been fraught. Although the county that houses the oldest town in Texas has remained happy to highlight its European and Anglo-American history, in Nacogdoches, there's very little that captures the history and contributions of its African American community. Today, there exists only one historical marker at the county courthouse, one historically black church that sits empty while awaiting funding for restoration and proper use, and one black cemetery that's maintained by Stephen F. State University's History Department. Most significant with this is the African American Heritage Project, which works to highlight the history. African American Heritage Project works to highlight the oral histories of African Americans in East Texas, to fill the historical void that has been left by a lack of attention to African Americans' contributions and their communities and histories. Though this absence is strikingly tragic, the collective silence and historical amnesia about the history and contributions of Black East Texans is not surprising. East Texas has a rich history of slavery and subsequent segregation, and unfortunately there are few reports of the black community, with the exception of a few lynchings in the 1880s and 1890s. With its southern characteristics and ties to cotton production, we can assume that the town was much like any rural area of the post-Civil War South, where violence, intimidation, and disenfranchisement were an everyday reality for African Americans. In the century following the Civil War, at least 5,000 African Americans were lynched, a form of execution intended to inflict extreme pain and intimidation among Black Americans as a way to maintain systems of white supremacy in the years following slavery. In Nacogdoches County, there were at least 3 black men lynched during the 1890s by white supremacists, including members of the KKK. This well-documented culture of violence continued for more than half a century before the Civil Rights Movement, which saw the establishment of Nacogdoches County's NAACP chapter. However, today there's still continued neighborhood and school segregation, with documented inferior facilities, books, and equipment in the historically black schools and neighborhoods, and there are still some segregated proms in the area. However, the most prominent theme to come out of the histories and oral stories of African American residents in and around County Line is the importance of community, past and present. Close relationships in Black communities stem from the need to protect one another in a segregated society. Nacogdoches and Angelina counties, like many towns in the South, remained segregated well into the 1970s. And the Black community raised their children to be aware of the rules and traditions one must abide by to live in such a racist environment. The love and support of the African American communities stood in stark contrast to the injustice of segregation when young people faced obstacles outside of their own communities. Several local businesses refused to integrate or serve African Americans. All public facilities were segregated, including water fountains, schools, buses, and movie theaters, and many businesses shut down rather than choose to integrate when the time came. It's also well documented that law enforcement agencies resorted to racial intimidation, false arrests and fines, and fraudulent and violent charges against members of the African American communities throughout the 20th century. Many in the area have lamented that integration has been responsible for the loss of close-knit African American communities. Several more describe the reliance on family and friends for individual and community survival. The sequential impacts of the Great Depression and World War II led to the depopulation of many of Texas's freedmen's settlements. While recent economic changes in the African American community, with nearly 90% of Blacks in the county living below the poverty line in 2010, have also made it difficult for families to remain in the community while much of the population ages out. Regardless of the cause, these vibrant and vital communities are sadly, vibrant and vital communities are sadly facing, making exhibits, books, and stories like that of the Upshaws of County Line that much more important in the preservation of historically Black communities in the rural South. And as a historian and a proud East Texan, I hope that this project will continue to highlight the importance of this community and communities like it in East Texas, and inspire others to preserve and tell the stories of communities that, in the words of Beatrice Upshaw, largely were the backbone of the South. Thank you.
My turn? Well, first of all, I really want to thank again wonderful Mary Bones and the Museum of the Big Bend. This is the 8th venue for this exhibit, and we've been treated well everywhere, but Mary and her staff have set a new standard, and I'm not just saying that because they're here. It happens to be true. When I went to school and took history classes, Texas history, American history, I wouldn't taught anything at all about places like this. What I learned was that after emancipation, former slaves became sharecroppers, which is essentially another form of slavery, or they became domestics working in town for white folks. Full stop, that was it. So when I started got involved in this, it was in the late 80s. My parents lived in Nacogdoches. I lived in Austin. I was born in Nacogdoches but didn't grow up there, but they moved back there. I would go visit, and I was looking for something to do. I was a little bored at times, and I had gotten into photography a few years before that. And long story short, one of our family friends who was a professor at SFA then, F.E. Abernathy, the legendary Ab Abernathy, told me that there were in fact a lot of old Black communities out in the countryside that dated from the emancipation and that they owned their own land and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, what? That's not possible. How could that possibly be? They just were slaves and now they're landowners? It didn't compute. So I became very curious, and being curious can be dangerous sometimes. You get into things you didn't know you were going to encounter, and you have to deal with it. So Professor Abernathy introduced me to a man named Marion Upshaw, who was then a school administrator in Nacogdoches schools. He was born and raised in County Line, and I went to him and I told him that I would be really interested in learning about his community, coming out, taking photographs, learning about the history, how it all came to about. And he said, well, okay, come on out and meet my parents. So I went out, I'll never forget, the day after Thanksgiving in 1988, I went to County Line for the first time. And that didn't go terribly well with his parents, because they'd apparently had a bad experience with a white photographer before. So Marion took me outside the house and said, well, why don't you go a little bit further down the road and introduce yourself to my Uncle Monell. That was his father's younger brother. He did not volunteer to go with me. So it was at that point in time that I was beginning to have doubts about my intent and just what was I thinking. But I did get back in my truck, and I went down and I parked under the big red oak tree, which is still there and very important part of their whole place there. And I got out of the truck and I saw a very large man in a hog pen that I took to be Monell. Sure enough, that was Monell. I went over, I introduced myself. I told him that I was interested in learning about the community and taking pictures there. And would that be all right with him? He paused for a moment. He said, well, I don't see why not. And that's quite literally all there was to it. From that day forward, he and his wife, Leota, made me welcome in their home without exception. They were some of the warmest, most open and loving people that I have ever met in my life. And so now their children, that was a little different. I had to go, I had to prove myself. But anyway, that's how I got started out there, just purely out of curiosity. I just couldn't believe that such places could exist, and yet there are hundreds of them in East Texas. There's a book that, if you're really interested in this, it's called Freedom Colonies, Independent Black Texans in the Time of Jim Crow, written by Thad Sitton and James Conrad, published in '05 at the UT Press. That is an excellent overview of these communities in East Texas, and I think that Thad identifies roughly 300 or so communities. Since then, another researcher who's going to do some important work, Dr. Andrea Roberts, who teaches at A&M, in her research in Jasper and Newton counties, has discovered another 200, I think. So this is an ongoing process. A couple of stories. I mentioned that while Monell and Leota took me in immediately, I had some proving to do with their children. I first became a part of, I first went out there, as I said, around Thanksgiving in 1988. County Line has a big homecoming the weekend of the second Sunday in August every year. So my first opportunity to go to homecoming was the next year. In the meantime, there were some of the family lived in Texas and around, but some of them lived in California. And so in that intervening time, these people, particularly in California, were hearing Lord knows what about this white guy poking his nose around in the community. And so when I went out that Saturday morning in August of '89, got out of my truck, one of those people, Tinchy is his nickname, he was a California highway patrolman. He met me at the gate, and he wanted to know what the heck I was doing. Now, he was very polite, he was very professional, and I knew exactly what he was doing, and I must have said the right thing because he let me in. But we became good friends, and unfortunately he had died a very premature death. But anyway, that was one example of what happened. But then the pièce de résistance, so to speak, would be about 3 years in. I had gotten to know Leota fairly well. I had done recorded an interview with her, the first one I did. A lovely woman. And on homecoming Sunday, I can't remember if it was 91 or 92, she stood up in church in front of God and everybody and claimed me as her foster son. So, to the astonishment of everyone, me included. But then that sort of cemented the whole thing because nobody was going to go against her. Okay, one final thought about this, the significance of these communities. I think that the people who lived in these communities probably didn't have a clear sense of just how historically significant they were. Because I remember several years in, one of the other sisters, May Upshaw Ham, who I got to know pretty well, we're good friends. She told me that until I started coming out there and acting like it was important, They just thought it was home. That was all. And so a lot has happened now. Thad's book, of course, has done a lot to create an awareness. Andrea's work is going to enhance that, I will predict, greatly. And right now, the issue, and I've gotten to know some other communities in Jasper County and Newton County. I've gotten into a couple of other communities, and the ongoing issue in all of these places, though it differs greatly depending on which one, is survival. You know, the generation of my age, like Monel and Leota's children, they had 13. That generation was the last generation to be born and raised in County Line. Now, Elia's a little different. She was, I don't think you were born there, but you were raised there. And that's very unusual for someone her age to actually, not only she was raised there, she lives there now. That's extremely unusual for someone her age, at least in County Line. So, but some of these places are disappearing. They're being surrounded by cities and sort of taken over. A major problem historically is that from a legal standpoint, they don't exist because they're not incorporated for the most part. And if you're not incorporated, then all bets are off in many ways. So that's the issue that is ongoing, and different places are dealing with it in different ways. And we can only hope that through the academic work that people are doing, that will enhance the awareness of people, and it'll make it easier to sustain these communities. And with that, I will hand it to Miss Elia.
Cool.
My dear niece.
I didn't prepare anything to speak about. I guess.
Oh, that won't bother you.
No, it won't bother me. I guess I can say, yeah, it's considered strange that I wasn't born in County Line, thank God. I was born in a clean sanitary hospital in Bedford, Texas. But it's been interesting growing up there because I was born in '91 and Uncle Richard has always been around. And now I've gotten to see 3 or 4 generations of kids thinking, Uncle Richard was adopted?
Oh, I forgot to tell that story.
Yeah. You can tell the story. It's adorable.
This is in my book. It's the very last thing in my book called My Favorite Story. I mentioned earlier that Brother Tenchi died prematurely, and he was in California. So the family members went out to California, to Los Angeles for the memorial service. And so we went into this church. It was standing room only. He was a very popular guy. He'd worked in all kinds of different capacities as a highway patrolman. So one of the sisters, Marilyn, known as Sister Girl, was up at the front introducing the Texas contingent, sitting in the pews. And I was sitting here, and then where Dr. Williamson was Sister Faye, one of the other sisters, and on the other side of her was her granddaughter, Rhea, who was then about, I think, 8 years old.
She's on the program crying,
Yeah.
being handed over.
But so Marilyn comes to me and she says, our adopted brother, Richard Orton. So after the service is over, Faye comes to me and says, when that happened, Rhea turned to her and said, I didn't know Uncle Richard was adopted. That's as good as it gets, folks.
So I get to see all these kids and everyone grow up, knowing Uncle Richard's always been around, always going to be around, that sort of thing. So coming up, it's not really strange to me that, we have all these pictures and this history and everything like that. I can only imagine what my mother thought, when Uncle Richard rolled up saying that he wanted to take pictures of her.
What do you think she said?
She probably was just going to wait and see how it all panned out. But I am very appreciative. I mean, we got all these wonderful pictures taken for free. And
you got a book for free, too.
Got a book for free. It's just been fantastic. He's a sucker. Anyway, so it's interesting seeing, like, when you go to these different exhibits, all of the good. And sometimes when I go back home, I'm just like glowing, like, yeah, this is all great. But then I look around and think, that house is empty, and we used to have 2 churches there, and one of them is gone, and one of them it's still hanging on, and I'm really appreciative of that. And but some of the things from a bad point in time still remain. A way of thinking about outsiders. I have some people in my family I would say are racist. Sorry, babe. There are people, but that just comes from these stories and these experiences that they've had. Another thing that's sort of a little bit negative that comes from being born and raised in Depression era and in a rural area is the way people deal with illness. And that includes mental illness and physical illnesses. My Uncle Tinchy, that Uncle Richard talks about, had stomach pains for months and did nothing about it. And his brother found him dead one day, My Aunt May, who passed away recently, stomach issues for months. By the time they found out it was pancreatic cancer, it was way too late, I had my own experience just last year, had stomach pains for months, and I ended up in the hospital for 4 days. That's just something that you just don't deal with. You have to work, you have to go, you have to raise kids, you have to do all sorts of things, and you can't really sit and think about yourself. And so with that kind of attitude about never really thinking about yourself and never really thinking about how important things are for you and your family, I am incredibly grateful to have someone who say, hey, wait, let's think, let's talk, let's look around and see what rich history you have. I mean, we were told that when the founders got there, the Piney Woods was virgin pine forest. It still wasn't hardwood forest like it originally was, but it was pine forest they said the trees were so big and so spaced apart you could drive your wagon in between like roads, and it was soft. And yeah, they cut all that down because they had to grow cotton. They had to grow their own food. I hear from my parents and my aunts and uncles, of course now all the pine trees have come back with a vengeance, that you could just stand on your porch and see all around, But you can't do that now. The pine trees have grown up because of the need for growing cotton and things like that. That's done. But it's interesting to see how far they got on what little they had. My grandfather's brother had 16 children, 2 sets of twins in that, and not all of them made it to adulthood. I just only found that out recently. There was a night where their mother was working and she gave birth and didn't make it. That was just a fact of life. They ate, for all of them, something called pot liquor. Now, I don't know if any of you know what that is or have the pleasure of knowing how disgusting that is, because I've had it before and it's nasty. Their mother would take the stubs of the greens that grew in the ground. They'd already picked clean all of the leaves. Take the stubs, put it in with some water and maybe some meat. Maybe. They very rarely ate meat. And boil it down until it was a thick green slime. And she would drizzle that over some cornbread, and you ate it, and that was it. Pot cake, which is the burnt rice stuck at the bottom of the pot. Disgusting. I've heard so many nasty stories about how you can cook a raccoon and how you can eat a possum and how you can eat even an armadillo. And it's just, it's disgusting to me. But when my Uncle Fred, I call him my Uncle Fred, he's my cousin, he's my grandfather's nephew. When he was in Vietnam, he was very popular because he had no problem eating snakes. He had no problem doing any of that stuff, because how is that any different from, how he grew up? And so you hear that and you think, sick, and you don't give any other thought to it. But then when someone says, look, this is part of your history and this is a bigger story than just your family was broke, The bigger story is that they struggled to do that. My grandfather was born in 1909 and my grandmother was born in 1919. And I was told all the time, what depression? This was everyday life. It didn't matter, what other people got. They never really received government assistance. Not even in their old age did they ever get a check from the government. Their children supported them, or they supported themselves. My grandparents didn't babysit me for free. My mother had to pay them, because them babysitting me was time. You didn't know that, did you?
I didn't.
Yeah, my mom paid them because the time they spent babysitting me, which they had a liberal way of doing that. They could have been working, and this was when they were in their 70s and 80s, and my grandmother was still cleaning people's houses and stuff like that. So that's why when you see her with her head down, like she was tired, she was still working and growing her own vegetables and mowing the lawn and taking care of me and my cousins. And so it's interesting to see, you know, what you think of as we're just a family that works hard. We were poor, now we, you know, middle class. This is the American dream. When really it's much bigger struggle than that. So now, I think that if it hadn't been for Uncle Richard and his tenacity and the beauty of his work and the importance of it, I wouldn't be mad when I hear that one of my cousins, again, has sold off a piece of land that used to be in the family and now is gone. You know, I wouldn't be upset and so hurt, like actually hurt, like sit up at night and cry. Like, it's not even my land, but why would you do that? Why would you do that? Well, because they don't know. You know, that's not a part of them, but for me, that's everything. You know, they're not making any more land, and they're not making any more land with history such as the hanging tree, or, you know, because if you walk around that land, anybody can say, oh yeah, Aunt Jeffy bought that land when she did this, that, and the other, or that's the trail that your great, you know, Uncle so-and-so went down with those white men when they wanted his horse and he never came back, but they came back with the horse. You know, there's stories in every single part of the land. And I wouldn't care as much if it weren't for people like you and people like my Uncle Richard who are interested and understand that that's very important. So there we have it. Sorry for rambling.
A great ramble.
I have a couple of cousins who are making their way basically to come back. They just have some things that they need to fix up and figure out, you know, but they're very, very, very interested, which is way better than what it used to be, which is these same people say, I'm never walking a dirt road again to, the city is loud and I'm tired and I really want to come back home, you know, so yeah, a few.
Question. How many acres was it originally established and how many acres remain today?
Originally?
I think it was around 600 originally.
Yeah, I can't tell you what it is today because everyone has their piece. Like, for instance, when my grandparents died, all 13 of their children got a piece divided up between them. I am going to be inheriting 60, and that's considered a small piece. And one of my uncles has around 200. I believe, and then one of my great aunts just gifted a couple of 100 acres to different people. So
Sounds like it was more than 600 then.
it was a little more than 600.
I have two questions.
Oh.
I'll just go ahead and ask them both now.
Okay.
What part do you think desegregation played, and this is for the panel, for the demise of your area? And my other question after that, and I'll just ask it now, is how many photographs are there all together in your collection?
I have no idea. Thousands, and most of them aren't worth looking at, the vast majority. So I had a lot to draw from to get this, and that kind of, in my approach, you know, I don't know how, there's other photographers here maybe feel differently, but the more you take, the more likely you are to get one that's halfway decent. So now as far as, you know, to answer your first question, everybody probably has a different idea, but one of the things that I became aware of fairly soon after getting there and talking to people was that when desegregation occurred, their school went away. Mm-hmm. And that was huge. Yep. The school and the church were the cultural centers of the community, and all of a sudden half of that was gone. Now it's sort of the segregation thing is a double-edged sword. Particularly, I mean, I don't know how it was in the cities, but in a place like County Line, that was a blow. That was a blow against the community when that happened. I don't know how y'all feel.
Well, I think I agree, but also I think in my opinion it was, of course, the devastation caused by segregation and Jim Crow was horrible, but at the same time, in many ways, communities like County Line were protected.
Yes.
By having a space that was their own and their own
Right.
property, and kind of because they weren't integrated and because they had the support of their community and their family really helped create a lasting, strong, bonded community. But integration, with all of, as momentous as it was for civil rights and for progress and civil liberties, in many ways kind of led to a system, I guess it permitted a system to come in that allowed for further disenfranchisement of communities like County Line, that because they weren't integrated into the larger town, that they were kind of out of sight, out of mind. So because of that, you don't see support for the African American community. You don't see investment in history and preservation or education. And with the income, the average annual income of African Americans in the county being 90% below the poverty line as of the 2010 census, it's pretty significant. So when you've got a system that is supposed to help help make progress in civil rights, and all the fantastic things that integration and desegregation does, you also have this flip side where it kind of creates a system that allows for communities like this to be left behind, in many ways intentionally, by kind of mainstream white societies. So, especially in places like Nacogdoches and Angelina counties and Jasper and areas where even in I think 2008 there was a lynching in Jasper.
Yeah, well, the James Byrd affair, is that what you're referring to?
They did 2008.
Okay.
Yeah, there was even because I was a student at SFA when that had happened. I remember that distinctly. It was also there was also in 2007 or 8 the largest Klan rally in nearly a century was held in Tyler, Texas, in the neighboring county.
Yep.
So there's still quite a bit of progress to be made, and so I'm really glad that projects like this are kind of highlighting the importance and historical significance of these communities and how vital they are to, really to African American life in the South, and to all of us. Really.
Another point about the schools, that when the school when the school was in County Line, it was strongly supported by every parent. There was never any question or issue about that. When the school disappeared, the parental support of their children in schools, to say the least, was greatly complicated when those students were sent to the white school in town. It was like just a big cut in that connection that would be hard to overestimate the importance of that.
I'll tell you something about it. Not to take away from anybody, because you're absolutely right. When they desegregated the schools, that didn't do anything for anybody's mind, obviously. And what that, I believe, fostered, because I experienced it myself, was I'm getting the hell out of here. My uncles literally had to beat people into submission. They told me all the time about how I had a substitute teacher, Coach Sides, who was the football coach when my uncles were around. My uncle said that, they didn't, as he said, after the school was closed, well, you got to get to work. If you're not going to go to that school, you got to go to work. And they were working out in the fields a lot. And they were huge boys. And he said Coach Sides was licking his lips when he saw him coming in. And Uncle Gus said, well, why would I play football? And he's like, well, you get to do this and that. He's like, do I get to hit white people? He said, yeah, you can hit all white people you want. All right, shoot. I'll play football. And but his brother, my Uncle Pete, said, yeah, they were race riots all the time, that they beat people up. So that when my mom, their youngest sister, came around, and my aunt sister girl, their second youngest sister came around, well, they were just so sweet and so nice to them, but they beat them into submission. But having to do all of that, it's strange. Why would you want to have to go through all of that just to go to school? Why would you want to have to go through all of that just to go to work? So yeah, you say, I'm getting out. Almost every single one of them, I believe, either moved to Dallas or they moved to California, because why would you want to be around people like that? Myself personally, everybody asked, well, what university are you going to go to? I said, someplace far away from here. Because I had to call the Office of Civil Rights. You know, they would spray "Christy is a nigger lover" on the bathroom walls. They would call my grandmother's house saying, we don't want any more niggers in our school. They would do all sorts of horrific, mean things. And that's just because we were forced to be around each other, and they were forced to have to deal with people they didn't feel like they had to deal with. So when you do that and you get people around who don't want to be around each other, and there's animosity there, and you can't really ignore your own culture of, I guess, it's not hate to them, but sort of segregation. For instance, my aunt and my mother went to school with my home economics teacher, and they were great friends. She married somebody in the Klan, and they were horrified, and they still don't really talk to this day like they used to. And they left. I mean, why would you want to be around people who would do something like that to you and would be like that to you? And my own friends and classmates in school, when all this stuff was going on, I heard not a peep. So I said, yeah, I'm leaving, I'm getting out. I'm probably never coming back. That's what I think that did, you know, on a different level. It just makes you not want to deal with people like that, hateful people. Yes, ma'am.
My husband and I just finished reading recently that wonderful book, The Warmth of Other Suns. It's wonderful, and you kind of answered what my question was going to be, that great migration of, you know, that occurred mostly from Texas to California, kind of thing. It sounds like a lot of your family went there. How much did it decimate the community? Was it like a lot of people left, or?
Every single one of them left. Of my aunts and uncles, they left. They went somewhere. They either went to California or they went to Dallas, Fort Worth area. I can't think of a single person. Wait, no, yes I can. My Aunt Bird, she stayed because she was married to my Uncle Verdell, and they lived in Mount Enterprise. Uncle Pete went to the Army. Uncle Gus went to the Army. Uncle G went to the Air Force. Everybody left.
Most of them came back, though.
Most of them came back, but I mean, just imagine going from having all of your kids and everything and thinking you're going to have their grandkids all around you to just a couple of them, you know, every now and then, and it's, yeah, it completely and totally gutted everything. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that your community adopted Richard. You know, it's part of your.
Don't you think I'm adoptable?
He's incredibly adoptable.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
Well, it's kind of self-preservation, you know, look what you've done, and they can hold on to you for that, which is absolutely wonderful. What I guess my question is, I know education is a big deal with the community, so where's the legal representation? Are they coming back to try to incorporate these communities, or to try to, you know, really speak to the issues at hand?
This is what Dr. Andrea Roberts is trying to do, and not only her, but there's other people involved in it. For example, one of the communities that I've gotten to know more recently is in Jasper County, of all places, and it's called Dixie, of all things. Okay, there's a story behind that. The founder of the community was a slave whose name was Richard Seal, Dick C. That's the story I was told, anyway. And so anyway, this community is there are a number of people from it. Some of them still live there, some of them don't, but they come back, who are absolutely determined to recreate and to preserve what they've got. And something that they did, which is remarkable, the old school building in the property that in segregation days that they went to in this community had gone through some changes. It had been a VFW hall and other things, and it went on the market to be sold. They bought it. They immediately formed an association, and they bought it, and they call it the Connection Center, and they are using it to have community events, and they rent it out for other events, homecomings. Quinceaneras, believe it or not, is a big deal. And then I so admire them. They are absolutely determined against all odds to make this work. They started a 4-H club that's a part of this Connection Center so they can connect with their youth, which is a huge piece of the deal if you're talking about preservation. So there are things happening, and something I meant to say before, Dr. Roberts has started something called the Texas Freedom Colony Project, and you can go on Facebook and find it. And so things are happening. It's not all negative. There are some positive things going on.
And I think also with the kind of anniversaries of Reconstruction, a lot of historians and academics are kind of looking to this period and hopefully coming at it with kind of, with new eyes to preserve these communities as well. So I think there's a lot of...
That's the impression I get.
I think the timing also right now means that this time period is starting to get a lot more attention than it has previously, which is great.
Yes.
Leah, do you have cousins or friends kind of your age? It sounds like your situation, you and your husband, that's pretty unique.
Yeah.
That you are living in County Line, but do you have other people that are kind of want to take on that charge with you and or just interested in living there or living there with you?
It's interesting that you say your age. No, not my age. But I have a cousin who is my grandfather's nephew's son. I don't even know what that would be.
Who are you talking about?
Victor.
Oh, Victor, of
Victor
course, yeah.
and
Tell them about what Victor's
yeah,
doing.
Victor and Dondo. Good Lord. You can call him Anthony if you feel silly calling him Dondo. Dondo, Dominion, and Victor, they have bought an old store building in Douglas, and it's called Uncle Doug's for Douglas, and they had a family member named Doug. And they're turning it into a restaurant. What else?
Grocery store?
Farmer's market. They're selling local produce and local crafts and wares. And
Your mother's going to make chocolate.
my mother has a chocolate factory inside. It's all glassed in. It's pretty interesting. They have a pond. They're going to have
Douglas
a covered
is now a
fishing area, the
destination.
stage. So they're putting a lot of effort into it, and I think that if anything was going to inject some life back into getting people to come, it would be, work the family business.
Right.
I mean, we did have a store in County Line, and of course that guy is gone, and the store is gone, and the land is for sale, which is a big source
know
of
that.
anxiety for me. But yeah, then of course they're in their 40s and 50s, so I can't necessarily say they're my age, but they're doing something big, and they've sunk over $1 million into the venture, and it's a beautiful place, and yeah, they're there, and I think as time goes by and my aunts and uncles get sick, the ones who are there, their children will come back. That's why I came back. One of my uncles passed away, and it turns out I had a lot of work to do for what good it did. So I think that's why my mom came back. Her father got sick. So who knows what the future holds, but for now, I am the youngest I always tell my husband, I'm the youngest person here by decades. This is very strange. So yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question, because we're going to have a book signing with Richard in the library. So.
I would just, go for it.
Go.
I was just going to say, you are amazingly articulate.
Oh, thanks.
And I encourage you to continue getting your message out there. I mean, I realize how I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I remember in the 50s and early 60s that there were separate restrooms for blacks and whites, and I just realized how stupid, how unaware. I grew up kind of that comfortable life and just being ignorant, even though I remember the civil rights movements, and I marched, and people threw stuff at us, but there's still so much awareness that we need to get to. And so you've chosen, Miss Ali, to be a librarian, and if you're doing what you love, bless you, wonderful, good for you. And you have the opportunity to encourage young people to get their education and become lawyers and PhDs and get on faculty at universities and start broadening people's minds. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank
I've
you.
heard that before.
Fantastic. So go for it. Write your book or whatever. Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One last thing, I should have said this before, speaking of books, her mother, her mother Beatrice, who unfortunately is not here, about the time I got there, maybe a little bit later, wrote a personal memoir that she calls A Biscuit for Your Shoe. And it's actually a series of stories about her growing up in County Line, things that happened, older people, younger people, her friends, her aunts and uncles, lots of really interesting stories. And that book is going to be edited and published by the Texas Folklore Society. That's just happened in the last few months. It's not going to come out until the fall of 20, but that's going to be that's going to be a whole other way of looking at what this story is about.
It's hilarious.
And a biscuit. I have to tell the biscuit for your shoe is the name of it, and that's one of the stories. And that's all about is that on Sunday morning, they would all get up and get dressed in their finery and to their little patent leather shoes. They would shine with an extra biscuit. They'd open the biscuit up and they'd shine it up because of the grease that was in there. But they'd have to take another biscuit with them to church because by the time they got there walking in the red dirt, it was all covered up again. So that's one of the stories.
They were broke.
That's
Well,
it.
I want to thank you all of you all for coming out this morning. What a wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of our presenters, Dr. Williamson, Richard, and Elia. This has just been fabulous. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.